Thank you so much, Edgardo. I'm very moved. Why do we cry? Evolutionary psychologists tell us that crying is relational. Crying, lamenting, mourning, weeping and wailing demand a response. They tell us that something is wrong, and they tell other people that something is wrong. They do not simply ask for a hearing. They demand it. They make a moral claim as rudely, insistently, and unavoidably as possible. Because soft whispers, subtle glances, insistent gazing, and polite requests went unanswered. Crying, lamenting, shares the pain. It makes it loud. It spreads it like a net to catch witnesses, compel acknowledgement, and compel redress. Crying is uncomfortable. It makes it hard to breathe, hard to see. There is an abundance of salt and snot. We get puffy, maybe our clothes get all twisted up and wet and wrinkly, and our hair gets unaccountably messy. It's exhausting. Sometimes we call it ugly. We get embarrassed and we don't want people to see it because it is undignified and it makes us seem weak. But what if I told you that crying, lamenting is holy?
Amen.
What if I told you it is prophetic? What if I told you it is necessary for the work of reconciliation and redemption? Our scriptures offer us many models for prayer. If you have spent much time with the book of Psalms, you may have noticed that lament is far and away the most common and the most varied. Unless someone thinks that Christians don't need those prayers because Jesus taught us how to pray the Lord's Prayer. And it's not very lamentful. Well, that's true, it's not. But Jesus also taught us by his own example. Jesus wept. Jesus cried out from the cross words of a lament psalm, my God, why have you forsaken me? What role does lament have in our time of ecological crisis? In 1949, Aldo Leopold wrote one of the penalties of an ecological education is living alone in a world of wounds. More than 50 years later, Glenn Albrecht gave a name to the feeling that Leopold expressed, coining the term solastalgia to describe a homesickness you feel even when you're still at home. A deep distress, a feeling of powerlessness, and a sense of loss that many have felt in response to both large-scale and local climate and environmental changes and losses. Since Albrecht's influential work, which focused on effects of coal mining and drought, scholars have given increasing attention to what has been called ecological grief and climate grief. And this grief is understood as an internal feeling of loss, sadness, helplessness, and anxiety accompanying the physical losses, the losses of a particular environment, conditions, material conditions of life, but also the ways of life, the culture, loss of identity, and anticipated losses, the things we see coming on the horizon, future losses of place, of land, of species, of culture. Ashley Kuhn-Solo and Neville Ellis argue that ecological grief is a form of what Kenneth Doka calls disenfranchised grief, meaning it goes unmarked, unnamed, unrecognized, and day after day, the hits keep coming, and we hold back the tears. We adjust. Some of us remember waking to the musical song of the birds. We remember the honeybees we worried about stepping on when we played in the yard in our bare feet in the afternoon. We remember the scintillating sparkles of fireflies at dusk. And we remember that we used to see a whole lot of stars at night. We remember a season called spring. We used to enjoy for a few months before the blazing heat of summer. But as the temperature climbed and the smog crowded our lungs and the pavement got wider and the animals got fewer, we adjusted. We wondered if we just made those things up. We celebrated the technological advances, the miracles of automotive transport, air conditioning, all the cool stuff and all the cool clothes. Maybe we never had the chance to actually actively grieve. But grieving, not just feeling the loss, but acknowledging, processing is important work. It's been argued that a central process in grieving is the attempt to reaffirm or reconstruct a world of meaning that has been challenged by loss. And when external factors limit those public expressions of grief, that process of reaffirming or reconstructing a world of meaning is cut short. That's what we mean by disenfranchised grief. But Leopold's description of living alone in a world of wounds misses something important. We are not alone. And we are not alone in our grief. A key antidote to disenfranchised grief is to engage in rituals and practices of memorialization and accountability. These rituals have a social dimension. They reflect and activate beliefs and values in the form of meaningful, recognizable behaviors that connect people to one another. But they do more. They also connect people to God. This is where lament comes in. Lament links the bereaved to one another, and it links individual and community alike to God. Lament is more than words and more than tears. It is a way of turning to God in our weakness, in our fallibility, and in our honesty. It is a way of coming together as community in a time of great pain and need and woundedness. It names the harms that we have experienced, but insists that they are not final. That is not the end of this story. Lament also have a penitential coloring. Lament confesses wrongs committed and commits instead to reparation. Lament brings the wounds to the surface so that they can be acknowledged and healed. The practice of lament is sacred, relational speech and action central to the relational work of justice. And the framework for these relationships is the bond of covenant. Now, like lament, covenant is a thoroughly biblical concept. And we are most accustomed to thinking of covenant as the fundamental framework for the relationship between God and Israel. And we affirm that we have been grafted into that covenant relationship. And that it names the relational responsibilities and commitments, the promises and consequences that God and people have agreed to and sworn to one another. It is in the context of this covenant relationship that people join their voices with one another and raise their lament to God. But people and God are not the only covenant partners. In the scriptures of Israel, earth too is covenanted to God and people. Biblical scholar Hilary Marlowe advances a model of interrelationship that she calls the ecological triangle, in which God, people, and non-human creation are all partners with one another. We are all inseparably connected. And our colleague Ellen Davis renames this ecological triangle a covenant triangle. And in doing so, she draws out a further insight. The relationship between non-human creation, or I should say the relationships, plural, between non-human creation and God are as real, as enduring, and as intimate as the relationship God has with humankind. Earth has a story, and a story with God that intersects ours and exceeds it. Acknowledging this partnership is to acknowledge the agency and subjectivity of earth and non-human creatures. It is to acknowledge that earth is not simply a supplier of resources to fuel our ambitions and satisfy our desires. Creation is good, not because it is good for humans, but good in itself before humans exist. Psalm 72 names mountains and hills as collaborators in the work of justice. They are agents of prosperity and righteousness. In Isaiah chapter 45, the Lord declares, "Pour down from above, O heavens, and let the clouds rain justice. And let the earth open so that they may bear fruit, righteousness, salvation. And let earth cause justice to spring up in unity. I, the Lord, have created this." In this stunning apostrophe, God's unique character becomes known in the ordering of all creation toward justice. Heavens, waters, earth, vegetation are active participants in a responsive, organic, and creative network of justice that extends far beyond human knowing and human purview. The fruit of justice takes concrete form in the lives of God's people, but extends beyond God's people. It also extends beyond this natural world into the workings of human history, right? They are intersecting each other, leading to urban redevelopment, liberation, and repatriation for captives and refugees in Isaiah 45. This collaboration in the work of justice has the potential to transform practices of domination and structures of hierarchy into covenantal practices, into covenantal partnership characterized by mutual care and mutual custodianship between human and non-human creation. Non-human creation exercises agency in service of justice through acts of worship, prophecy, and witness. Earth takes the blood of Abel from the hand of his brother, exposing Cain's crime and participating in divine justice by withholding strength, its vegetation from him. In Amos, Marlowe argues that the cosmos works alongside the Lord to expose those who are attempting to flee judgment. Earth speaks prophetically for God and helps to execute divine judgment, fulfilling divine decrees of destruction and restoration alike. Isaiah summons earth and heavens to witness God's complaint against God's people, while heaven's depths, mountains, and trees testify to Israel's redemption from captivity. As an active stakeholder and participant in the work of justice, non-human creation also voices its lament and cries out for redress. So what does Earth's lament sound like? What does it declare? What moral claim does Earth's lament make on us, Earth's covenant partner? The Earth Bible team urges attention to the many languages of Earth that send a message, whether to humans, to other members of the Earth community, or to God. And this is not to assimilate Earth's ways of speaking to our own, but to recognize the rich and complex subject position and agency of our multiple and diverse covenant partners. The lament of non-human creation does not have one voice, one form. We know that trees form communities and alliances across species of trees and fungi. They warn each other of drought and disease, attacks and dangers through interspecies networks of roots and fungi. Other plants emit sounds vibrating at frequencies inaudible to humans. They also communicate with other plants by emitting volatile organic compounds that tell their stories of injury, stories of disease, predators, extreme temperatures. Scientists have analyzed the electrical signals that mushrooms use to communicate with each other, with one study finding differentiated patterns analogous to a vocabulary of over 50 words arranged with a syntax resembling the form of sentences. Non-human creation speaks, testifies, and cries out in ways we are only beginning to comprehend. Several of Israel's prophets used the medium of human speech and human language, especially poetry, to give voice to Earth's lament. They knew the Earth and its non-human creatures as covenant partners with God and humans, and they urged their human communities to listen to Earth's lament and to raise their voices alongside that of non-human creation, amplifying Earth's lament and joining it as dialogue partner and partner in lament. Practicing communal lament with the earth has profound moral implications. Consolo and Ellis argue that experiences of grief and mourning illuminate our relational ties, but also our fundamental dependency upon complex ecological communities, and in turn, our ethical and political responsibilities to these systems. In witnessing and giving expression to Earth's lament, we affirm our Earth's agency and covenantal partnership. We confess that our sins have harmed the earth and its inhabitants. We take responsibility for our past, present, and future actions, and we turn together to God. Now, in a time of severe drought and devastating locust plague, the prophet Joel called the human community to witness to Earth's devastation. Joel's wake-up call to his audience begins with the act of listening. Hear and give ear, all inhabitants of the land. And what follows is an act of memory and evaluation. Has such a thing ever happened in our days or in the days of your ancestors? This noticing, this reality check cuts through habits of denial and those incremental acts of adjustment that bury the evidence of loss and harm beneath deceptive veneers of progress and inevitability. After listening and memory follows testimony. Tell your children of it, and let your children tell their children, and their children tell another generation. What the cutting locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the locust left, what the hopping locust left, the destroying locust has eaten. The testimony cuts across generational differences. War generation has a word for the boomers. The boomers have a word for Gen X. Lest we not forget, Gen X has a word for millennials, have a word for Gen Z, have a word for Gen Alpha. Each generation has a different position in relation to past, present, and future. Each generation has valuable wisdom and perspective. This cross-generational testimony is also thorough. It is exact. Joel needs to tell us about 4 different kinds of locusts. This kind of exacting testimony does not elide the chain of harm and consequences. It does not diminish the magnitude. It inventories the damage, identifies the causes, and publishes the findings. But inventories are dull. They don't land in the gut, the heart, the center. Joel continues by reframing the crisis in metaphorical language and vivid, poetic imagery that carry a strong emotional punch. The ecological crisis, he says, is warfare. The invading species is an army. Its teeth are the teeth of a lion, a wild and ravenous apex predator. And having offered these arrestic, Poetic images of assault, threat, predation. Joel voices God's own lament, painting a picture of the devastation these armies and predators have wreaked upon the parts of non-human creation that people care most about, the crops. The army of locusts, God says, has laid waste my vines and splintered my fig trees. It has stripped off their bark and thrown it down. The branches have turned white. What can the people do in the face of the land's devastation? God and the prophet issue a command. Lament. Lament like a lover who has lost their beloved. Look upon the land's devastation and see in this landscape of death and destruction the loss of your cherished spouse, your covenant partner, your own beating heart, the love of your life. Now, it is not to be a solitary lament. It is shared labor. The priests and ministers of the Lord help to create the space, the social container for this shared work of grief. They convene the assembly and model for the people this uncomfortable practice of lament. Whatever your role within your community, this is part of your role. To convene your community for the necessary work of lament and model it for them. This lament yields to earth's lament. God hands the microphone to non-human creation. Joel says, the fields are devastated, the ground mourns. Ground mourns. For the grain is destroyed, the wine dries up, the oil fails. We are not accustomed to hearing earth speak to us. We're accustomed, in fact, to ignoring what the earth has to say. In our scriptures, we expect to hear God speaking to us, and we listen for the words of the prophets. But earth also speaks. Earth cries out to God and cries out to us. Typically, after the declaration here in Joel 1:10, this rude person left her phone volume on. Sorry about that. After this declaration that the earth mourns in Joel 1:10, interpreters typically hear the verses that follow as the voice of the prophet, maybe the voice of God. But I'm sorry, Joel just told us that the ground is speaking. The ground mourns. Can we hear in those verses that follow the voice of the earth? Can we hear the substance of the earth's lament? If we don't, it will remain abstract, metaphorical, a poignant idea that makes no claim on us. But if we acknowledge earth's subjectivity and agency, we can hear in the verses that follow earth's cry, earth's testimony, and earth's demands. So I invite you to hear Joel chapter 1, 11 to 14 in earth's voice. Earth says, "Be dismayed, you farmers. Wail, you vine dressers, over the wheat and the barley. For the crops of the field are ruined." Earth's lament calls us out. It speaks directly to the humans who look to Earth's resources for sustenance. Earth's lament names the failure of our partnership. It names the objects of our collective hope and loss, the wounds of our shared landscape, and the seemingly intractable conditions in which we have labored in vain to effect positive change. Earth continues, the vine withers, the fig tree droops, pomegranate, palm, and apple, all the trees of the field are dried up. Surely joy withers away from the people. Earth connects the dots for us. She helps us to name the depth of what we have lost. As the trees wither, so does our joy. The fruits of the earth are also the fruits of justice. They have shriveled to the point that they are inedible. They hold no juice, no sweetness, no nourishment. Earth becomes our teacher in lament. Put on sackcloth and lament, you priests. Wail, you ministers of the altar. Come, pass the night in sackcloth, you ministers of my God. Grain offering and drink offering are withheld from the house of your God. With this summons, earth invites its human partners to affirm their kinship with earth, to acknowledge that harms to the earth and to non-human creatures are also harms to humanity, to our children, to our future, to mirror in human bodies the land's desiccation. Earth invites humans to make of this failed harvest an intentional sign of all that has gone wrong, to clothe ourselves in humility. Remember that word humility comes from the word for the earth. And join the earth in vigil, replacing the offerings of grain and drink with offerings of our own bodies, our own blood, our own tears. Sanctify a fast, declares the earth. Call a solemn assembly, gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land to the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. With this fourfold command, earth instructs the community, this community, to unite across divisions, to assemble all the inhabitants of the land. They are already fasting because there is no food. And earth commands the people to sanctify that lack, to see what may yet be holy in the state of things as they are right now. What does that mean here in North Carolina today? The North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services documents a litany of environmental crises here in this space, this land. North Carolina is experiencing hotter temperatures, sea level rise, impaired air quality, more frequent and intense hurricanes, precipitation events, all as a result of climate change. And they further highlight the effects on the bodies, minds, and spirits of human beings. I quote, "These hazards diminish health by causing or exacerbating heat-related illness, asthma, respiratory illness, cardiovascular illness, impaired mental health, and other conditions." And they add, existing inequities in environmental health exposures are exacerbated by climate change. Older adults, children, low-income earners, outdoor workers, Spanish speakers, indigenous communities, and communities of color are disproportionately affected, end quote. Those disproportionate effects are manifestations of the very environmental racism that Dr. Ben Chavis first called out in 1982 when the state of North Carolina chose to isolate the hazardous waste from PCBs in the North Carolina county with the highest percentage of Black residents. Dr. Chavis sanctified the fast, if you'll permit me to say so, by undertaking the work of protest, complaint, and assembly, demanding accountability and redress demanding justice. Earth calls us now to hear creation's lament, to witness the devastating effects of our failure to uphold covenant, and to inventory those effects on non-human creation and human creation, and then to turn and return to God, to earth, to one another, and to voice our own lament in turn. This labor of lament is not the end of the work. It is the necessary beginning. It is the work of decentering the most privileged among us, and even decentering humankind in order to center the needs of the most vulnerable and neglected. It is the step of taking ownership of the harms human beings have caused, so we can commit to their redress. It is also acknowledging the pain and depth of our loss, our ecological and cultural grief, so we can accept where we find ourselves in this moment. It is honest assessment of the costs we have paid, the costs of inaction, the costs of change. It is an expansive inventory, not just of the harms, but also of the resources yet available to us. This labor of lament will ensure that our commitment to action is grounded not in wishful thinking or delusional dreaming, but in realism and accountability. In our lament, we will join the earth in calling upon God, our other covenant partner, to aid us, to do that of which we are incapable on our own. And together we will cry out like a mother in labor to bring to birth a future of justice, reconciliation, and healing for all creation. Thank you.